Hello, this is Dr. Paul Cottrell, and I'm going to be talking about two videos here. One's going to be a more longer video dealing with World War III as we approach it. Good morning. And the next one is going to be a clip of Professor Ferguson dealing with debt servicing relative to defense spending. It's going to be a just a clip. So, and then I'll interject after I play part of his lecture. But I will do another video that goes into depth. It's going to be probably two parts. It's going to be probably more than 2 hours long. And we're going to go deep dive on the problems that are happening in the United States. But I wanted to start with the debt service relative to defense spending.
Global tensions are, by most accounts, at their highest since the Cold War. Conflicts in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia risk escalating. So the big question is, are we heading towards a third world war? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and possibly Donald Trump. They're all leaders whose behavior and endgames are very difficult to predict. So what does their presence mean for future world security?
Doomsday clock is how scientists have been warning the world how close we are to nuclear Armageddon. The higher the risk, the closer to midnight the hands move. It's now at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. Many countries at the center of global conflict do have nuclear capabilities. Russia, for one, and the ongoing war in Ukraine.
They should understand that what they are doing now, trying to scare the whole world, it does risk conflict with nuclear weapons, which means the destruction of civilization. Don't they understand this, or what?
A clear warning to NATO members that the conflict could spill over into neighboring countries, given the right circumstances. Then there's the violence in the Middle East, with Israel, a nuclear power, retaliating for the attack by Hamas on October 7th.
So this is a dangerous moment in the Middle East. We will continue to work to avoid a wider conflict in the region. But we will take all necessary actions to defend the United States, our interests, and our people.
From the start, a big concern has been whether Iranian proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon would be drawn in. So far, that hasn't happened. And then the growing tension in the Taiwan Strait over the reunification of the island with nuclear-powered China.
To uphold the One China policy, we should support China's peaceful reunification. If we want to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, we must resolutely oppose Taiwan independence, because Taiwan independence and stability in the Taiwan Strait are incompatible.
The United States has said it would defend Taiwan were it to be attacked. And all of this doesn't touch on the potential risks of AI or climate change, which both present existential risks. The picture might look bleak now, but does that mean we are inevitably heading towards the end of civilization, or not?
Well, let's bring in our guests. Colin Alexander is a senior lecturer in political communication.
So what I wanted to bring up before we go deeper in the roundtable, I want to play what Niall Ferguson has to say about debt service and defense spending. Now, he has written several books about the UK and empires and about money and wars. So we need to pay close attention to what Neil Ferguson is saying. Just my quick cliff note on this before we start. people need to understand that these things that are starting to emerge are going to start ending up being an existential threat to the United States' constitutional freedoms. The constitutional republic that we have in the United States is at a fragile point, and it's being pressured by an economic vector and a social vector. Now, the economic vector has a couple components to it. One is the decoupling of labor and capital because of AI. Also, the restructuring of the economy as the government is trying to move from a fossil fuel economy to a green economy where there's less mobility because of the 15-minute city. The standard of living is going to start to go down. So there's that economic vector. There's also a debt service vector at the personal level and at the government level. So there are instabilities that are happening. Now at the social level, the social vectors are the wokeism, the destruction of family, God, and country. So this push for reparations, push for DEI, push for affirmative action, all these social things that are starting to emerge where anyone can be anything and they want to be detached from reality is problematic in terms of keeping the nation strong, stable, and a going concern. So all these things are emerging. Now, I take the stance that I am well suited to try to explain the emergent behavior of a chaotic system. That was self-evident during the 2020 crisis. And I think it's also self-evident with what is emerging now. And if what I think is going to emerge happens, it's going to be much bigger than what we just went through in 2020. No one, in my estimation, at least in this realm of alternative pontification, is as suited as I am to be able to explain what's just going to emerge. I know that sounds a bit hubris, maybe condescending, but everyone has a place in this world. And if we don't exercise our skills, like a catastrophe may happen. So let me play what Niall Ferguson had to say, or Neil Ferguson. I keep on calling him Niall. Sorry, Niall. I mean Neil.
Average for all voters. So that answers that question. And I suppose it leads naturally into my fourth question. Is there a political economy of democratic self-destruction via excessive debt and/or inflation? Those of you as old as I am will recollect that this was a fairly common hypothesis of conservative thinkers in the 1970s when inflation was in double digits in most developed countries. And I think it's still a question worth asking today, though inflation has not reached 1970s levels. Ever since I began writing about the United States, and I began writing about it more than 20 years ago, there has been a more or less unsustainable fiscal policy at the federal level. And one can see that it's not unique to the United States, because there are countries, including the United Kingdom, including France, Italy, and Japan, that have even higher levels of public debt in relation to gross domestic product than the United States does. The inflation problem has not recurred in the way that it did in the 1970s, or at least perhaps I should say not yet, because it's worth bearing in mind that what happened in the last few.
Now, what's important to keep in mind is the United States is the world power economically and militarily. As of this recording, maybe it changes tomorrow, who knows? But yes, other nations may be more in debt, but they have already are at a lower tier in terms of standing economically and militarily.
This also happened in the early 1970s, and it, I think, is still premature to declare the inflation problem over, though economists itch to do that. But at any event, the significance of these fiscal and monetary data are political as much as they are economic. It is already clear, and this relates to my last question, it is already clear that the United States is spending more on interest payments than on national security at this point. And this makes it quite difficult for the United States to pursue the kind of foreign policy that the more hawkish American politicians would like it to pursue. Not that Ukraine is a particularly expensive outgoing compared with the entire American defense establishment. But I find this a very telling chart, that we are at a point when interest payments are overtaking the defense budget.
It's not just the overtaking the defense budget, but it's also the rate of expansion of the debt service year over year compared to other years. So we're in a problem. We're definitely in a problem. And the models, and he'll mention this in his lecture, but the models that are projecting from the government budget office are projecting that it's going to get worse over the next decade or so, couple decades. So this is an empire declining event that is starting to emerge. Now, a lot of people maybe that are listening may not care. Maybe they aren't really fully understanding what this means. But literally, the government has spent too much money in relative terms to being able to protect the nation. And when a major event happens, such as in the Asia theater with Taiwan and China, the United States is not going to be on a footing to be able to fight it. And this is why I said that we may win the war, but we will lose. And the question is how much will we lose? If we lose the war, then the model of economics and the model of politics will be mirrored in other countries that will try to mimic the Chinese if China wins this war. If the United States wins the war, it will be so costly in terms of treasure and blood that it will no longer be the government of strength and of hegemonic power that emerged right after World War II. So either way, the United States is going to lose. It's just a question of how much will it lose. It may win the war, but lose the economics. It may lose the war and lose the economics. So this is a very dangerous situation that is starting to emerge for the United States and the free world. We have to be, the United States is literally the last beacon of hope for preventing the loss of democracy, the loss of a constitutional republic. And, you know, if we cannot fail. If we do fail, we're literally going into the dark ages in totalitarianism.
In the United States. And this must have, it often has in the past, it must have implications for how sustainable American power is abroad. My penultimate question. Could the Anglosphere democracies succumb to illiberalism or even autocracy too? Now, this illustration was used by New York Magazine for an article my old friend Andrew Sullivan published in 2016, warning that if Donald Trump were elected, then American democracy would be fatally endangered. And I'm sure there will be more and more articles in that vein as this year unfolds. It's very remarkable how worried Americans themselves are about the stability of their own democracy. 7 out of 10 Americans.
So what we'll do is now go to the round table. I'm going to go into a deep dive of the 2-hour lecture, or almost 3-hour lecture that he did when he was taking questions. So we'll do that in a different video. But the point here is that there are economic data points that are emerging. They're showing that the United States is weak because of its spending, and that it's not going to be able to emerge victorious economically when we do engage China on the battlefield. It's just a question of when will we win the war or not. But economically, we will fail. It's just a matter of how much will we fail. And that's because of these social programs that are getting worse. And this is part of the reason why I keep on saying that we have to control the border, control our spending, and prevent reparations. Because reparations is going to push the country over the edge in having that economic prowess that we used to have since World War II.
At Nottingham Trent University. He joins us from Sheffield in the United Kingdom. Rishi Paul is a senior policy fellow at the European Leadership Network. That's a think tank. He joins us from London. And here with me in the studio is Martin Smith. He's a senior lecturer in defence and international affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Rishi, I want to come to you first. The UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps gave an interview recently where he said we're moving from a post-war world to a pre-war world. Didn't really get perhaps as much attention as you would expect for a very significant comment like that by a senior leader in British politics. What do you make of what Shapps was trying to get at?
I think, I mean, it's hard to discern exactly what he meant by that. The way I interpret it, and it's along the same lines as what Emmanuel Macron recently stated with sending French troops potentially into the Ukraine conflict, is he's trying not to rule out all possibilities. It's a demonstration of resolve that the UK does remain committed. But at the same time, it is slightly incendiary. It's an escalatory remark. So it isn't helpful in that sense. So it could be interpreted either way. The question is, I mean, how will President Putin interpret that?
Tammy Collin, is there an element here of a politician saber rattling so that when the next budget comes along in the UK, it's just a matter of days away now? Is there an element of putting this out there so that suddenly people start taking defence more seriously and your brief gets more cash?
Yes, partly. So I think that Grant Shapps is obviously, as Defence Secretary, has a lot of conversations with the military, and the military will be attempting to pressurise him into militaristic narratives, which will increase the spending power. However, I do also think that we must bear in mind that any war which happens must have an element of public backing in some way, and that in order to achieve that, this has to happen many years before the conflict occurs, in order to sort of have a kind of ready public who is prepared to potentially make sacrifices, or indeed is sort of ready for potential losses, or indeed upheaval in their lives in some way. So this seems to me is just a sort of a beginning of the wheels turning in this perspective. Whether this actually leads to any kind of World War III or even any sort of major conflict at all for the UK is another matter.
Martin, it seems almost strange to ask the question, but are we on the brink of World War III? Everything we're seeing, lots of rogue states, conflict in various different places, and people have now got weapons that could quite literally wipe us off the face of this planet.
I don't think so. And the reason for that is, as you said in your last statement there, Enda, because unlike the previous two global conflicts, World War I and World War II, if you take those as our points of reference, one of the biggest differences in the international system now, of course, is the presence of nuclear weapons and the system of mutual nuclear deterrence amongst the otherwise antagonistic great powers that gives. So I think it's probably more accurate and perhaps useful to argue that we're entering into a new Cold War. As you say, what we're starting to see, as during the original Cold War between the mid-1940s and the late 1980s, is the upswing of proxy conflicts. So Ukraine is classically what we call a proxy conflict. You've got one of the great powers directly involved, of course, Russia, and you've got the other, the United States, organizing a support effort for the Ukrainians, but not directly committed itself. Similarly, people are talking about the conflict in the Middle East, or the possibility of proxy conflicts there between Iran and the various groups that it is supporting and sponsoring, Hezbollah and the Houthis, and again, the United States primarily. So World War III, I think, is too apocalyptic and is not therefore a useful way of trying to sort of capture what's going on. But I do think there's significant evidence now that we're moving back into the kind of international the type of international conflict that we saw, particularly during the 1950s, from the Korean War through to the end of the 1980s, and the
I think that we need to really focus on this concept of right after the Berlin Wall fell, and we didn't embrace Russia into the sphere of the Western world, economically and politically. And because we lost that opportunity, it's led to poking the bear in this expansion of NATO and policymakers forgetting or ignoring the mistakes that the United States and the other Western powers like the UK, France, and Germany made when the Soviet Union dissolved. And now it doesn't mean that Putin is been lily white, he's not. But the thing is that we wouldn't have Cold War 2.0 if it wasn't for the mistakes that we made right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there is a 2.0 Cold War. I would say that the proxy wars, that was basically
happening even right after the war. Right after the Berlin Wall fell. I mean, shortly after, we went right into Iraq as, quote, protectors of Kuwait, because Iraq went into Kuwait, and that was kind of our reason to get in. So there's been wars going on. Now, we were a little bit more engaged in the Middle East in 91 with the Gulf War, Desert Storm. So I can see in how these international policy commentators would say that maybe there's more an uptick in proxy wars, because our involvement in the Middle East was more direct compared to, let's say, the 1980s in Afghanistan, where we were funding the Taliban in the 80s to fight the Russians. That was a proxy war. So what's going on in Afghanistan is very similar to what's going on, I would say, in Ukraine, except Russia seems to be having the upper hand in Ukraine versus Afghanistan. So we probably are seeing some more proxy wars, but this 2.0 Cold War, I would say it started to emerge shortly after the Berlin Wall fell, which sounds paradoxical. You would think that the Cold War would end with the Berlin Wall falling, but it was this hubris that was taking place with the United States that kind of kept the Cold War cold and enduring. And I would say that if you look at some of the old footage of the military pre-Desert Storm, I think we were a little concerned about our ability to fight a war with Russia. But once we did the Highway of Death, and Desert Storm was so quick, I believe it was like 100 hours or something like that. It was relatively quick and devastating for the enemy. If you look at some of that footage of these generals talking about what we accomplished with Desert Storm, you could see that there was hubris and relief, but it was hubris that the United States has all this power, and that Russia and the Soviet Union were basically bankrupt. So because we had this hubris, we ended up not embracing Russia and trying to make the world a more peaceful place, and getting the peace dividend, and realizing that we came right to the precipice of nuclear war, especially with the Cuban Missile Crisis and some other events that were taking place during the Cold War. But we didn't do that in embracing, and now we are where we're at. So I wouldn't say that the Cold War is new. This 2.0 concept, it emerged shortly after shock therapy with Russia trying to stabilize their currency, brought to you by Jeffrey Sachs. So, and the IMF and the World Bank and all this stuff. So it emerged. And it emerged very quickly. This is not a new phenomenon. So I disagree with him on that point. But there are proxy wars. But as you look at the history of what was going on with our engagement in the Middle East post 9/11, and we're having activity in Afghanistan and Iraq. The intelligence agencies, and we're talking about the CIA and SAC and JSOC, they were engaged in rebellion in countries surrounding Russia. And this was discussed during the interview with Putin and Tucker. So the CIA has been, over the past 20 years, trying to further weaken and further further weaken Russia and extending the Cold War. So this is not, again, this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that emerged slowly right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so during our activity in the Middle East, post 9/11, these intelligence operations that were going on, let's say in Chechnya and in other other areas that were not aligned with Putin's policies, not aligned with protecting Russia, but really weakening it. In that case, it was proxy war at a lower intensity. So we've been doing this proxy war stuff way before Ukraine. And then if you want to go into, was the United States involved in the coup in 2014? Most likely we were with Ukraine. So this also is another data point to suggest that these proxy wars have been going on for quite a while. It's not a recent thing, and that the hubris of the United States since the Berlin Wall fell is a major contributor to, quote, Cold War 2.0.
Union's withdrawal from Afghanistan. Those two were both classical proxy conflicts.
Rishi, let's talk about Vladimir Putin. I see lots of cartoons online and discussion and commentary comparing his actions now to what Adolf Hitler did in the 1930s. Appeasement did not work with Hitler. I mean, are we looking at a situation where Putin just keeps going after more land in more places and sits there just waiting for an even bigger conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of truth in that. Vladimir Putin is a classic opportunist. If he sees an opportunity, he will go for it, like he did.
This is the point that I'm making with the talking heads on these roundtables and these international policy quote experts. They always look at what Putin is doing wrong, but they're not looking at the larger arc in contemporary history with what the United States did wrong. The United States was, quote, opportunistic right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The United States has been opportunistic with expansion of NATO. The United States has been opportunistic with its clandestine operations in trying to cause nations to create instability around the perimeter of Russia. This is a fact. This is not opinion. I mean, this is historical fact. So the United States has been opportunistic. Now, it doesn't mean that Putin is not an opportunist. I'm sure he is. But we need to keep in mind that the United States has been a major contributor to the instability of this situation, and our decisions are leading to World War III. And it's important to keep in mind what Neil Ferguson said. We can't afford it anymore. But you have socialists, you have ultra liberals pushing additional policies that will bankrupt the country, such as reparations. We can't afford it anymore. We have to lower the social net, reduce the social net, reduce the social spending, truncate government, destroy the national security state, bring down the debt. And with that, we have a winning chance to emerge as a nation, the United States, as a nation where we will be economically viable. We're becoming less and less economically viable because of this over indebtedness. But the ultra liberal doesn't care. Like what Miss Austin said, who's on the committee in New York for reparations, there is a deep part of society that believes that there's structural racism and that structural racism should be rectified through reparations. The country cannot afford it, but they're going to push it. And they're going to push it because you wave a check in front of a voter, they're going to vote for that party that's going to give them the check. It's that simple. They're buying votes. The Democratic Party is setting up in motion to buy votes in the midterm election we're now talking about 2026. And then the general election in 2028. They're going to try to buy the black vote through reparations. Now, the average black will vote Democrat because of that. And they don't care if they destroy the country. They don't care. They don't realize that their actions are literally going to wreck the family car.
Crimea, except with Ukraine, he underestimated the resolve of the Western states to form an alliance around Ukraine, and this has been to his detriment. The challenge is, and I think a better analogy actually is the proxy wars, is that unlike Afghanistan, this is slightly different in the sense that it's not quite the same because unlike the 1980s, the Soviet regime was not under threat. I think Vladimir Putin feels this insecurity, and his regime could feel the pressure of this. And the volatile mix of nuclear weapons and insecurity creates a dangerous cocktail, which could lead to escalation. And yes, it is similar in the sense that it is based on aggrandizement, the same issues that are happening at the moment with Taiwan as well. It's not too dissimilar from that.
Colin, your thoughts on Putin's actions in the last decade or so?
Well, I mean, I also wanted to just discuss what both of my guests have just mentioned there. I think that one of the key areas is Taiwan, and Taiwan's an area that I've done quite a lot of research on. I think that given the Taiwan Relations Act in the United States, that should China engage in military conflict with Taiwan, that may well bring in a US-China angle to this, which then begins to spill into concepts of total warfare, I think. The other thing I wanted to say was nuclear weapons, this kind of nuclear peace theory concept, I think I find that's rather worrying because there is an element of confirmation bias here. Just because we didn't have a nuclear conflict in the Cold War doesn't mean that one is not possible.
Exactly. And I know that there are quite a few people that probably are anti-Kissinger. Even Miss Taiwan is anti-Kissinger because she feels as though Kissinger sold Taiwan down the road, down the river, for some sort of short-term peace with China. And maybe I'll have that, do a recording with her on that perspective. So there are many people that don't like Kissinger. Even Hitchens didn't like Kissinger because of the war crimes in Cambodia and what was going on with the Vietnam War. So independent of what one thinks of Kissinger, there are individuals such as Marshall and Kissinger and Eisenhower and many other thinkers of the time emerging out of World War II and navigated the country through the Cold War. Now, one of the longest lasting policymakers and international consultants in this genre was Kissinger, Dr. Kissinger. Independent of if you liked him or not, a nuclear detonation in a war setting did not happen. Now, we obviously tested nuclear weapons and tried to understand, could they be used in a tactical setting, on a battlefield and all this. And so, we irradiated soldiers thinking that we'd be able to harden them through lower doses of radiation, which was stupid. But we didn't have World War III. So independent of what someone thinks about Kissinger, and I'm not a fan of Kissinger, but I do realize that there are a series of individuals that were part of the International Affairs Council for the president that led to a prevention of nuclear detonation between World War II, after World War II and now. These individuals, the key point here is these individuals are gone. These individuals passed away already. I mean, basically the last one was Kissinger. So there's no one else out there that has the experience of that post World War II Cold War navigation strategically, tactically, to prevent nuclear detonation. So this is another variable that people need to keep in mind. I know a lot of people cheer that Kissinger is dead, and I would say that I would fall in that category too. But we have to be honest, we have to recognize that there was a contribution to prevent a nuclear detonation that Kissinger was instrumental in. So he's gone. Now, that doesn't mean that someone else can't step up to the plate and prevent a nuclear detonation. There are. But the point here is that we don't have, I'm afraid that we don't have the wisdom of some of our advisors that were emerging out of World War II and through the Cold War now, because they've all passed away. And we are complacent because of our lifestyle. And unfortunately, we are getting leaders that are about capitulating to social programs, capitulating to wokeism, and not paying attention to the real threats that are emerging economically and militarily. And until a leader steps up and says no, and we're going to protect the Constitution and protect the homeland, we're going to further decline. So I think that the individual that stated that just because a nuclear war a nuclear detonation didn't happen in the Cold War doesn't mean that a nuclear detonation won't happen in Cold War 2.0. I totally agree with that. And I think the major reason is that if we have policymakers that are making domestic social program mistakes that are leading to the bankruptcy of the country, why do we assume that they can't make the similar strategic mistakes that emerge into nuclear war on the international affairs front? In essence, our leaders on both sides of the aisle are a bunch of fucking idiots. In the United States, the Republicans, they're a bunch of morons. And the Democratic side, they're even more moronic. And we are run by a bunch of idiots. That's why I call it the Muppet Show. So, and this is dangerous. We're not that, I mean, yes, we're used to waking up in the morning and, you know, and turning on, let's say, the TV and, you know, and the weather. There may be a day when you wake up and there's a section of the world, I don't know which section of the world, maybe it's in the United States, maybe it's in Europe, that is nuked. So, you know, we're approaching a dangerous situation, and we have leaders that are idiots. We have leaders that are compromised. We have leaders that are captured. We have leaders that are trying to follow some sort of woke agenda, and they don't really care about how they destroy the constitutional freedoms or the economic prowess of their country. Do you think Macron is really a pillar of intellectual prowess, or a person that is going to navigate the world into peace? Do you think that the Canadian Prime Minister is a person of intellectual curiosity and prowess to be able to lead his nation into prosperity and safety? What about what's going on in the UK? We are fastly approaching a danger zone. And there's not enough people calling off both sides of the aisle of government, saying you're a bunch of fucking idiots, step aside, and this is how it's going to be done. Because at least in the United States, we have a lot of people that are just not paying attention, or just too stupid, or just don't care. They're apathetic. Now, we probably wouldn't have been able to emerge out of the Cold War like we did if we didn't have a president like Reagan, who wasn't apathetic, who had this kind of strong sense of purpose and what the nation could be. You know, his famous phrase was the golden city on the hill kind of thing. And America can still be that way. And Western democracies can still be that way. But not with the current wokeism in the population, and not with the current leaders that are running these different democracies. They're idiots. They're idiots. And maybe you have seen it, but I'm noticing that in a post-COVID era, just the stupidity is just increased. It's like as if people don't know how to think in a post-COVID era. People just like either they forget a sequence of events that need to take place for something to be done correctly at work, or you know, at you know, when you're going and buying something, or you're having something serviced. Just it's almost as if someone gave a big chunk of society a lobotomy, and they just don't know how to think anymore. Well, that's true also with our leaders. They're going to lead us right into nuclear war.
All weapons, I think, are meant to be used, and or have the potential to be used at least. So there's a worry there. I agree with what Rishi was saying. Vladimir Putin is an opportunist. I also don't think he really cares so much as to whether he loses or not. There's an element here of him wanting to be noticed and him enjoying the notoriety for its own sake, and the extent to which the Russian state thrives or is defeated or otherwise, well, still Putin will go down as a remarkable statesman, whether that's positive or negative.
Martin, just on that issue of Taiwan, are we looking in the wrong place here? I mean, a lot of the Western commentary is that, oh, Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons, whereas if China were to attack Taiwan or invade, that would inevitably lead to a massive conflict.
I think that is the challenge for the United States in particular, is it may find going forward over the next, by which I mean over the next 2, 3, 4 years, there's no prospect of the conflict in Ukraine ending anytime soon. As far as I can see. And at the same time, many analysts are now increasingly speculating about the possibility that Xi Jinping may feel strong enough to at least start probing, number one, Taiwan's defenses, and number two, the resolve of the United States to actually make good on the commitment that Colin referred to there, and to come to its aid if indeed it was to be attacked militarily by China. So I don't think it's so much a question of looking in the wrong place. I think it's the United States in particular has to be trying to balance those two in real time, focusing on preserving its own core strategic interests in Europe, not least the preservation of NATO as a vibrant and significant defense alliance, the most important alliance it's got, whilst at the same time maintaining its own interests and again its own reputation for being a reliable ally and for being trustworthy and dependable in terms of the commitments that it's given in the face of what looks to be a deteriorating security situation in the Asia Pacific.
Rishi, we live in a very worrying time. We see lots of countries who are spending huge amounts of money on their military. Here in the United Kingdom, they're not. The numbers are dwindling. The British Army is down to 76,000. I read a letter recently, an opinion piece by Tim Collins, the former SAS officer, and he said that Britain is defenseless. How worried should some governments be?
I think that's slightly overstated. I wouldn't quite agree with that assessment. So yes, it is true that defense expenditure has been dwindling significantly over the years. But the United States, the UK is very similar in the sense of with the United States, is that we're both a nuclear weapon state. Our contribution to NATO is with our independent nuclear deterrent. So Britain does play a significant role in that part. We are part of the NATO alliance, so we provide that umbrella under Article 5. So the idea of troop deployment, yes, Britain cannot play that role in the world. It's just not possible, but we do make a contribution elsewhere. The problem is, of course, that an independent nuclear deterrent or nuclear weapons, their value lies in their deterrent effect, whether or not they are credible. Obviously, engaging in a nuclear deterrence is a very risky proposition. It's dangerous. There's the problem of miscalculation, misunderstandings. Although Britain maintains a retaliatory capability, it's unlikely that Britain would ever be the one to go first in that sort of sense, using nuclear weapons. So it's purely a deterrent effect.
Martin, what does the general public think in the UK about the potential for a very significant conflict? Because there's an election coming in this country this year, and you've spent your life in defence, and you know full well when politicians go knocking on doorsteps looking for votes, people want to know about standard of living, cost of living, interest rates, mortgages, healthcare. Defence never gets a look in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So to answer your question, having said that, I think the public opinion isn't focused on the specifics of defence. These are the sorts of issues that we've been talking about today. Having said that, I think there's a clear sense, and opinion polls support this view, that the majority of people in the UK have a sense that the UK is one of the stronger military players in the world, point number one. Point number two, that is good, not just from the point of view of the UK being able to defend itself, its own territory, its own people, its own interest, but also to the extent that the UK plays a leading role, particularly in the...
I personally think, now I could be wrong, but I don't think I am, that the United States is far more superior in its power projection than the UK. I view the UK as a country that is auxiliary to the United States. There is synergy; they do help, but would they be able to walk in the shoes of the United States in terms of its military prowess? No, the UK could not do it. They're not strong enough, and they're not strong enough militarily, and they're not strong enough economically. And this is the point that Neil Ferguson's saying. UK lost because of its indebtedness, and the pendulum starts swinging the other way in terms of power projection, and for UK right after World War One, and it became worse after World War II. So the empire has already sunset for UK. So the UK could not, independent if you think that it was right or wrong for the United States to get into the Middle East post 9/11. But let's just say something like 9/11 happened in London. The UK would not be able to do a 20-year war in the Middle East economically or militarily. They don't have the power. They don't have the economic power, and they don't have the military power to be able to sustain something like the United States did. Unfortunately, the United States made the same mistake, or was approaching the same mistake that the UK did back in World War One, and that is over-indebtedness. And so to think that the UK, yes, they are a power. Yes, they are an economic power, and yes, they have a military capability. But to compare them to the United States, they're definitely lower tier. So, to my UK friends out there, USA number one.
European security environment through NATO and through its wider global network of alliances as well. So I think going back to our first question, what was Grant Shapps really getting at when he talked about this idea of being in a pre-war mode? But that's what does that actually mean, and what's the political point behind that? I think what he was trying to do was to appeal to that general, perhaps usually unfocused, but nonetheless real sense amongst the British population that we don't need to worry about defence actively most of the time, because actually, relatively speaking, the UK is pretty safe. And it's pretty safe because we are well defended, and we can debate troop numbers, we can debate equipment programs, we can debate level of defence spending. But I think there's this bottom line sense that there's no need to act.
I want to bring up a statement. The question here was, what are the process?
Camera 2 ran out of battery. So what I'm going to do is I'll just do it on camera 1. But the prospects for a bigger defense budget if you remember with Neil Ferguson's chart, it was defense spending relative to servicing interest payments on debt. Well, you can change that ratio by increasing the short term, not long term. This is not a long term solution, but short term with that by increasing the defense budget. The problem is that by increasing the defense budget, is it going to lead to a productive society to be able to pay down the service of the debt? So if you go into war production, if it is GDP expanding, and it gives you the ability to pay down debt, then you'll be able to engineer a way out of this problem that is starting to emerge in terms of a falling empire. But that's only if you can, have some sort of lasting productivity gain and a paying down of that debt. What's going to emerge in the United States is something quite different. And that is, we'll increase the defense spending, go in more debt on top of other social programs, because the standard of living is going to go down and there's going to be this push for universal income and reparations. So it's going to get even worse. But short term, it'll look as if things are going to get better. But long term, that's like the last domino to fall for this explosion of debt service relative to defense spending. It's the same thing that happened with the UK right after World War I.
Worry on the part of the UK per se, because relatively speaking, the UK is still sufficiently strong and sufficiently well defended.
Well, Martin, let's take a look at this from YouGov. So this is their poll showing that most people in the UK are now braced for a World War III. An estimated 53% think it's likely there will be another world war in the next 5 to 10 years. A minority of 31% of Britons think another global conflict is unlikely within that time frame, and including just 8% who think it is not likely at all. I mean, the general public, Rishi, do you get the impression people don't pay much attention to defense matters and just keep going with their lives regardless?
I think they certainly do go on with their lives regardless, but I do think they are conscious of this. I mean, the war in Ukraine has certainly been brought to the attention of the public, and it is something that resonates with them deeply. This idea that a brutal dictator can just pursue aggrandizement over another sovereign state is something which I think connects with the British public. Britain endured World War II. We survived the bombings in Hitler. Britain does not want another Hitler. So I think it is something that resonates deeply. But I also think that I don't think that the concern of World War III is something that necessarily is at the forefront of the mind of the British public. I think nuclear use, it's a difficult one to gauge exactly. A full-scale nuclear exchange between countries, I don't think is likely, and it does not resonate as deeply with the public. But I think the idea of nuclear use, perhaps on some limited scale, is something which is of concern to the British public. I mean, in Ukraine, for example, this idea of Putin escalating with tactical nuclear weapons on a limited scale to de-escalate. I think it is something that is of concern to the public, certainly in the conversations I've had with individuals. But I do believe that President Putin is deterred from using it in that sort of sense. But I do also feel that the public recognize that if you back him into a corner and regime change is something that he's concerned about, then it makes sense for Putin to consider this as an option. I mean, during the Cold War, nuclear weapons were designed to deter. Today, Putin thinks of nuclear weapons as instruments of warfare. That's where the challenge lies. And I think that's something that the British public do care about.
Colin,
The thing is that there's not enough of these policy talking heads looking at some of the psyche of our leaders and even the psyche of the population. How often do you hear the term in politics? Let's say a certain bill is being passed that they're going to do the nuclear option in Congress, to try to prevent something from being passed. They use these terms, the nuclear option, or if we're engaged in an enemy, that all options are on the table, which is just a euphemism for, nuclear weapons are on the table. So, to try to like demonize Putin, about, would he use tactical nukes? He might. I mean, there's a reason why people have tactical nukes. There is it's a means to try to prevent an existential threat. But it's also in the psyche of American politics. And I just think it's just wrong. When we use these terms like we're going to use the nuclear option, when people use that, especially in just passing bills, it's not a military operation, but let's just say they're passing a bill and they're going to use these terms like they're going to use the nuclear option and prevent the bill from passing by, doing some sort of filibuster or whatever. It's watering down the atrocity that could emerge from a nuclear detonation. It's a lack of forethought of the radiation victims from Fukushima, from 3 Mile Island, from Chernobyl, from Nagasaki, and from Hiroshima. Or what about the radiation fallout from all the nuclear testing that was going on in the 50s and in the 40s? So it's just a lack of concern or a lack of understanding of the real atrocities of nuclear war or nuclear testing or even a nuclear accident with a plant. And it's just just a lack of empathy. It's so, I don't know, I just feel as though there's just, our leaders are really stupid. They're just stupid. And they need to be called off on how stupid they are. Going back to Miss Austin pushing reparations, you had a population there that was Ivy League educated, and they were just, very cordial and just clapped and, and thought that she was so great. We need people to stand up to actually say, you know what? Make sure you don't break the family car because it's the only one we have. All right. But they don't care. They're too stupid. There's too many lawyers out there. Just demolishing democracy.
Your take on countries like North Korea and Iran in this conversation? Where do they fit?
Well, both are what we generally call pariah states, or are peripheral states. The question really is whether the United States feels it's in its interests to move forward with greater restrictions or control, or indeed perhaps even invasion of those states. In the case of North Korea, no, I would certainly say that North Korea is ultimately what we call a buffer state between China and US interests in South Korea, and also North Korea is nuclear armed and has that kind of element of what is known as madman theory, to sort of compensate for any shortfalls that it has. In the case of Iran, I just get the sense that there are just too many delicate elements within the equation here for anything to, at the moment at least, to move on that one. However, that said, we've seen in the 50s and in the late 1970s revolution, turnovers of power, and US meddling in that area. So I guess that's kind of one that remains to be seen, shall we say.
Martin, just in summary, I mean, you would hope that people step back from the brink and that things kind of calm down a bit and we can see peace break out.
I think peace breaking out is possibly a little over optimistic anytime soon, but perhaps more positively, stepping back from the brink. I don't worry as much as some people, I think, about the possibility of, just looking at the Ukraine context, the most immediate, obviously, security challenge in the European context, that either side is actually going to do anything that will tip over the brink to the extent of risking the use of nuclear weapons. Because I think if you look at the record so far on both sides, the point about deterrence, of course, is if deterrence is working, it's having a mutual impact. It's deterring both sides, not just one or the other. And I think if you look at the way that the Ukraine conflict has been.
And this is the point that I'm making. If you have a unipolar world, you have one side projecting power. When we had a bipolar world between the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union, the calculus of going to war was more thought out. And this is the problem where the United States really dropped the ball right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where we maintained a war footing while we should have moved more towards a peaceful existence. And things are now worse 30 years later. And it's a failure of the national security state. And this is the reason why I keep on saying that if you want peace in this world, if you want to maintain your constitutional freedoms in the United States, you have to demolish, destroy, and hold accountable the ones from the national security state. That means destroying the FBI, destroying the CIA, destroying elements of the Pentagon. This has to be done, because if we don't, we are going to lose our constitutional freedoms. We're going to lose peace and security in the world. We're going to lose our economic prowess. The national security state has done nothing but destroy freedom, prosperity, and security.
And the self-limitations that Russia is imposing on what it's doing and how it's doing it, not seriously trying to interfere with the grain corridor in the Black Sea, for example, that Ukraine has opened up, because that would run the risk of potentially Russian missiles or Russian military action affecting one or more of the neighboring NATO member states, as well as, and if you look, we talked about or alluded to Monsieur Macron's recent statement about the possibility of French troops in Ukraine not being off the table. But the very next sentence, he then went on to say, this is intentionally, what am I saying here? I'm not saying there's any plan to deploy French or any other NATO troops. This is contributing to what Monsieur Macron refers to as strategic ambiguity. It's sowing enough doubt, the intention is to sow enough doubt in the minds of Mr. Putin and his advisors as to.
I personally think that most of the Europeans would not go toe-to-toe with Russia. I think it's all talk.
Not to risk it, is not to risk an escalation. So peace breaking out anytime soon, I'm afraid I don't see that. But the possibility of a serious escalation in or around or over Ukraine, I'm happy to say that I don't see that either.
Thanks, Martin. Richie, final question to you. Just briefly, do you think the big risk is someone misinterpreting what someone else does?
Yes, I think that actually is a concern. And actually, I do believe that's where the crux of the issue lies. It's true that with deterrence, there is mutual deterrence, so both sides are deterred. But there is such a thing as...
Well, think about this. Nuclear war is an unconventional means of war. It's not conventional, it's unconventional. And when nations have other unconventional means of war, nuclear, biologic, chemical, cyber, celestial, whatever, all right, they're going to use it, especially if they have an edge where the other opponent doesn't have that capability. And this is why I kept on saying that in this new era, as we're marching towards World War III, one, we don't have the leaders that prevented nuclear war alive today, but we also have more precision, unconventional warfare technologies, especially in biologics, that are very scary, that could affect the germline. So, mankind is running right into a dangerous period. People need to wake up. And we shouldn't have nuclear weapons. We shouldn't have these unconventional weapons. But you have a national security state in different countries promoting, expanding, researching these types of technologies.
Inadvertent escalation, and that can manifest through miscalculation. So to put it into context, let's take in the Ukraine crisis. At the outbreak of the war, President Vladimir Putin raised the alert status. Now that was interpreted by the West and the US as possibly raising their defense contingency for command and control of nuclear weapons. So it was a form of nuclear signaling. And Biden did the right thing. He did nothing. He just acted like nothing has happened. But in doing so, he communicated a key fundamental of deterrence, which is assurance. In doing nothing, he was assuring Russia that the United States was not going to inadvertently escalate to the next level. And this is the problem with nuclear signaling. It's not just what's said, it's also what is not said. And maintaining this delicate balance between the two is incredibly difficult. Nuclear deterrence is a practice, is a very hard thing. It's in constant flux and it's changing. But also very quickly on another context, you could apply the same to India and Pakistan. They are two nuclear possessor states that actually have gone to war with each other. And through some form of miscalculation, they could make a mistake and it could tip over into a nuclear exchange. They're running what I call a hot hand fallacy. It's this idea that sooner or later something is going to go wrong because of statistical probability. So I think inadvertent escalation is something that is where the issue can lie.
Rishi, thank you. Colin and Martin as well. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube.
So that's my little take on World War III. And, keep in mind that in the United States, we have quite a bit of debt, especially relative to defense spending. And that's a very dangerous sign for an empire in decline. So please subscribe to all my channels. I have 3 channels on YouTube. I have Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble. Please subscribe. Make sure you click the notification button. Also follow me on X and GETTR. You'll see an announcement of a video that's premiering or something that's been posted. So make sure you follow me on social media. Please ask your social media followers to subscribe to me, and that way I can reach a larger audience as we approach tumultuous times. Also, please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the health supplements that I have. Let me go through some of the health supplements that I have. I have ashwagandha. This helps with blood glucose levels and brings down inflammation. Resveratrol, which is a strong antioxidant, and it's part of the anti-aging protocol. Clarity Factor, which helps to reduce brain fog. Probiotics, which will help to get your gut to absorb nutrients correctly and have better metabolism. Turmeric, which is also part of the anti-aging protocol to bring down inflammation, and it is an antioxidant. To get REM cycle sleep, you need to get proper REM cycle sleep, you need 3 REM cycles. Please go to my store and get the Good Night formula, and this will give you those REM cycles that you need. You need REM to detoxify your body and to consolidate memory. Also part of my anti-aging protocol, the Health Max 35. Take a teaspoon of this a day, gargle with it, swallow it. It'll neutralize pathogens. If you're not feeling well, take a tablespoon or 2 a day. Omega-3, really important to help with cardiovascular disease. This will improve your lipid profile. And go to the store and get my strong antioxidant, which is C60. I have it in coconut oil, in avocado oil, and I have it in a 2 ounce, a 4 ounce, and an 8 ounce configuration. You take a teaspoon of it a day or a full dropper a day. It's a very strong antioxidant. It'll soak up free radicals, slow down the aging process, improve the cellular stress that's happening because of the free radicals. And it'll also improve the mitochondrial health, so you have an increase in ATP. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the health supplements. Lastly, please, if you could, especially the international audience that can't get my products, please, if you would like to support my work, or even if you're a domestic consumer of my content, please go to my website, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Link is in the description of this video and all my videos. And you can donate on the homepage at the very bottom. You can donate through Stripe, PayPal, or buy me a coffee. That way it helps support my work and helps to cover the news and allow me to produce content for free. You can also go to my store and get my ebooks, and I have this new product out there that is a series of classes. It's 22 classes on pulmonology. You learn on how the lung system works. You'll be able to download PDF files for each of the lectures, and I do a video lecture for each of the 22 lectures. So, and you can, once you make that purchase of $50, you get full access to all 22 lectures, and you will get a password right after your purchase. Your unique password will allow you into the class section where you can download the PDFs and watch the lectures. So please go to my store to help support my work. Thank you for listening, and have a nice day.